The moon hung low in the ink-black sky, casting an eerie silver light over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Amber, a 24-year-old grad student, had the house to herself for the weekend while her parents were away on a rare vacation. She relished the solitude. The chance to study undisturbed seemed like a gift. It was a Friday night, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Amber was sprawled on the couch, surrounded by notes and textbooks, the TV murmuring in the background for some semblance of company. A light breeze rustled the trees outside, and the occasional creak of the house settling punctuated the stillness. She didn't notice when the faint scratching started. At first, it was so subtle that she brushed it off as tree branches scraping against the siding. But as the hours passed, the sound grew more deliberate, a faint, irregular tap, 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 like fingers drumming against glass. Amber muted the TV, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. It was coming from the sliding glass door in the kitchen. A jolt of unease shot through her. The backyard was fenced in, and the motion sensor lights hadn't gone off. Gathering her courage, she approached the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She flipped the light switch, illuminating the space. The sliding door was intact, locked, and there was no one in sight. Amber exhaled shakily, chalking it up to her imagination. She checked the lock again, then returned to the living room, determined to focus on her studies. The scratching didn't return, but the uneasy feeling lingered like a shadow. At midnight, Amber decided to call it a night. She double-checked all the doors and windows, ensuring every lock was secure before heading upstairs to her bedroom. Her room was her sanctuary, a cozy space with fairy lights strung along the walls and a stack of novels by the bedside table. She settled under the covers, clutching her phone, and scrolled aimlessly until sleep claimed her. She woke with a start around 3 a.m. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Her heart pounded as she tried to pinpoint what had disturbed her. That's when she heard it, a faint creak like a footstep on the stairs. Amber froze, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, praying it was just the house settling, but the sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable groan of the wooden staircase. Someone was in the house. Her mind raced as adrenaline surged through her veins. She reached for her phone, but the screen wouldn't light up. It was dead. She cursed under her breath, berating herself for not charging it earlier. Clutching the nearest object, a heavy bedside lamp, she crept toward her bedroom door. Her hands trembled as she eased it open, peering into the dark hallway. The house was silent again, but the oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. She tiptoed to the top of the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. The darkness below seemed impenetrable, and she hesitated, debating whether to investigate or lock herself in her room. Then she saw it, a faint glint of light reflecting off something metallic at the bottom of the stairs. Amber's breath hitched. It was a knife. She stumbled back, the lamp slipping from her grip and crashing to the floor. The sound shattered the silence, and an ominous shuffle came from below. She bolted back into her room, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her mind raced as she barricaded the door with her dresser, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She needed help. The landline was downstairs, and her cell was useless. She cursed her parents for not installing a security system. The only weapon she had was a pair of scissors from her desk drawer. Clutching them tightly, she pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours. The silence was deafening, every creak of the house amplified in her mind. Just when she thought the intruder might have left, she heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on her bedroom door. "Amber?" The voice was low and raspy, sending chills down her spine. How did they know her name? "Go away!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. The knocking stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Then came the sound of a key turning in the lock. Her blood ran cold. How did they have a key? The door didn't budge, blocked by the dresser, but the intruder didn't give up. Heavy thuds shook the door as they tried to force their way in. Amber backed into the corner, clutching the scissors like a lifeline. Tears streamed down her face as she prepared for the worst. Suddenly, the sound stopped. She waited, her heart pounding in her ears, but the silence stretched on. After what felt like an eternity, she dared to move the dresser just enough to peek through the crack in the door. The hallway was empty. Summoning every ounce of courage, she crept downstairs, her grip on the scissors tight. The living room was untouched, but the back door was wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. She bolted it shut and grabbed the landline, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the once quiet street. Amber recounted the night's events, her voice shaking. They searched the house and surrounding area, but found no sign of the intruder. The only clue was a muddy footprint near the kitchen door. As the officers assured her the house was secure, Amber's mind reeled. The intruder had known her name and had a key. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone had been watching her, planning this. She spent the rest of the night at a neighbor's house, too terrified to stay alone. In the following days, Amber changed the locks, installed a security system, and adopted a large dog for protection. But the sense of safety she once felt in her home was gone, replaced by a lingering paranoia. Amber never found out who the intruder was or how they had a key. The police investigation yielded no leads, and life slowly returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. But every creak of the house, every rustle outside, kept her on edge. The haunting memory of that night stayed with her, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are the ones that invade the sanctity of your home. The clock struck 10 p.m. as Sarah closed her laptop, finally finishing her work for the day. Her boyfriend, Ethan, had gone on a camping trip with his friends, leaving her alone in the small house they'd been renting for the past 6 months. It wasn't the most glamorous place, older than most of the homes in the neighborhood with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was affordable and had charm. She'd told herself that a quiet weekend alone would be relaxing. She was wrong. The night started uneventfully. Sarah cooked dinner, watched a true crime documentary, and was just beginning to settle in when she thought she heard faint knocking. It wasn't on the front door, but sounded more like it came from the side of the house. She paused the show, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Probably just the wind, she thought, dismissing the unease creeping up her spine. By midnight, Sarah decided to go to bed. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural. She double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before retreating to her bedroom upstairs. The bedroom was the only place in the house that felt safe, with thick curtains and a heavy wooden door she could lock. Lying in bed, scrolling through her phone, Sarah heard the sound again. A faint, deliberate knock, this time closer. It seemed to come from the living room or maybe the kitchen. Her heart started to pound. She held her breath, frozen, trying to convince herself it was just the old house settling. Then came another noise, the distinct creak of a floorboard. Sarah bolted upright, clutching her phone like a weapon. She swore under her breath. Someone was in the house. She crept to the bedroom door and locked it, her fingers shaking. Dialing 911, she whispered to the operator, explaining her situation. The dispatcher's calm voice assured her that officers were on the way, but Sarah felt anything but calm. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps came from the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and headed straight for her room. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around for something to use as a weapon. Grabbing a lamp from the nightstand, she waited, her pulse thundering in her ears. The doorknob jiggled. Sarah's stomach dropped. "I called the police. They're on their way," she shouted, her voice trembling. The jiggling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then a voice, a deep, gravelly whisper came from the other side of the door. "Sarah, I know you're alone." Her blood ran cold. How did they know her name? She wanted to scream, but fear choked her. The footsteps retreated, but Sarah didn't dare move. Minutes passed like hours until the sound of a door slamming downstairs startled her. Then silence again. Moments later, the red and blue lights of a police car washed over the windows. Sarah scrambled to unlock her bedroom door, sprinting downstairs to let the officers in. They searched the house, but found no sign of forced entry and no one inside. However, in the backyard, they found muddy footprints leading from the tree line to the house. Worse, they discovered a broken latch on the basement window. The officers assured Sarah they'd patrol the area, but as they left, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She wasn't convinced the nightmare was over. She spent the rest of the night in a hotel, unable to sleep. The following day, Ethan returned home. She told him everything, and they installed new locks and a security system. For weeks, Sarah jumped at every creak and shadow, feeling like someone was always watching. She even considered moving, but life eventually resumed its rhythm, until one night, months later. Ethan was working late, and Sarah was alone again. This time she felt more prepared. Every door and window locked, every camera monitored. As she brushed her teeth before bed, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security app. Motion detected at back door. Her stomach dropped. Opening the app, she froze. The camera feed showed a man standing just outside the back door, his face obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, staring directly into the camera. Then slowly, he raised a hand and waved. Sarah called 911, her voice cracking as she explained the situation. She grabbed a kitchen knife and locked herself in the bathroom, trembling as she listened for any sound. Minutes dragged on like hours until she heard the faint wail of sirens approaching. When the police arrived, the man was gone. They found fresh footprints outside, but no sign of forced entry this time. The officers did their best to reassure her, but Sarah couldn't shake the growing dread. The next morning, she found something chilling. A handwritten note slid under the back door. "You're never really alone." Sarah and Ethan moved out within the week, but wherever she went, that sense of unease followed. Every creak, every shadow, every unexplained sound reminded her that someone, somewhere, might still be watching. The wind howled outside as Lucy locked the door of her secluded countryside home. She had always loved the solitude, but on this particular night, something felt off. The house was old, a sprawling farmhouse inherited from her grandparents, and creaked and groaned with the weight of its years. The silence was unnerving, so Lucy turned on the TV for background noise. The glow of the screen cast flickering shadows on the walls as she curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. The news anchor was warning about a string of recent break-ins in the area, but Lucy barely paid attention. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and her security system was state-of-the-art. Her eyes began to droop when she heard it, a faint knock. It was so soft she thought she might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Lucy's heart skipped. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who could it be at this hour? She hesitated, then walked cautiously to the front door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. Her skin prickled. Maybe it was a prank? Kids messing around? Still uneasy, she checked the locks again and returned to the couch. Minutes later, the knocking started again, this time from the back door. Lucy froze. She knew for a fact that no one could get to the back door without triggering the motion sensor lights. Yet as she peeked through the kitchen window, the backyard was cloaked in darkness. The light hadn't gone off. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Natalie. "There's someone at my house," she whispered. "Did you call the police?" Natalie asked, her voice concerned. "No, I don't know if it's serious. I haven't seen anyone." "Lucy, you're alone in the middle of nowhere. Call them now." Lucy hesitated, but before she could respond, the line crackled. The call dropped. She stared at her phone in disbelief. No signal. The knocking started again, harder this time, like someone was punching the door. Her breath hitched. The sound moved, first the side door, then the windows, then the walls. It was as if someone or something was circling the house, testing every entry point. Lucy grabbed the fireplace poker and stood in the middle of the living room, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound stopped suddenly, plunging the house into an unnerving silence. Then she heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard upstairs. Her stomach twisted. She knew every inch of this house. No one could be upstairs unless they had already been inside. She bolted for the front door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, as if someone or something was holding it from the other side. Panic set in as she ran to the kitchen, trying the back door, but it too wouldn't move. It was as though the house itself was trapping her. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why are you running, Lucy?" Her blood turned to ice. How did they know her name? Her fingers fumbled as she tried to dial 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was completely gone. A noise from upstairs made her heart lurch, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Tears streamed down her face as she crouched behind the kitchen counter, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped at the top of the stairs. Then came the voice. "Lucy, I've been waiting for you." It wasn't human. The tone was guttural, unnatural, and sent a wave of nausea through her. She couldn't stay hidden. She had to escape. Lucy grabbed a knife from the counter and forced herself to move. She darted toward the living room, her breath ragged. As she passed the staircase, she made the mistake of glancing up. Standing at the top of the stairs was a figure. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, but its face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mask of pale skin stretched too tightly over a distorted skull. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Lucy screamed and ran to the front door, slamming her shoulder into it with all her strength. The door flew open, and she tumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, parked at the edge of the long driveway. Fumbling with her keys, she glanced back at the house. The front door was wide open, the darkness inside seeming to pulse like a living thing. She climbed into the car, started the engine, and sped away, leaving the house and whatever was inside it behind. Lucy drove straight to Natalie's place, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what she might see. When the police investigated the next day, they found the house completely undisturbed. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there. But Lucy knew the truth. She never went back to that house, and to this day, she still gets text messages from the same unknown number. You can't run forever, Lucy. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the windows of Alex's apartment. The city streets below were nearly empty, shrouded in mist. Alex, a freelance writer, had spent the evening working late, fueled by coffee and the occasional glance at their phone. The storm had knocked out the TV signal, leaving the apartment eerily quiet, aside from the rain. It was around midnight when Alex first noticed it, the faintest sound of movement. It was so subtle that they thought it might have been the wind rattling the windows. They paused, their fingers hovering over the keyboard, straining to listen. But after a moment, the sound stopped, and Alex dismissed it. A while later, they heard it again. This time it was unmistakable, a soft scraping noise, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the front door. Alex's heart skipped. They lived on the third floor of a secure building, and no one could get in without a key or being buzzed up. Slowly, they got up from their desk and tiptoed to the peephole, holding their breath as they peeked through. No one was there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Shaking their head, Alex chuckled nervously. Probably just my imagination, they muttered, locking the deadbolt for good measure. They returned to their desk, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate knock, knock, knock. Alex froze. This wasn't their imagination. Their stomach churned as they returned to the door, this time grabbing a knife from the kitchen on the way. Peering through the peephole again, they were greeted by the same empty hallway. They stepped back, their pulse racing. "Who's there?" they called out, their voice shaking. No response. The only sound was the rain hammering against the windows. Just as Alex began to rationalize the situation, their phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a notification. A text message. "Why won't you open the door?" Alex's breath caught in their throat. The number was unknown. Their hands trembled as they typed back, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "You know who I am." The knife felt useless in their hand as dread washed over them. Their first instinct was to call the police, but when they tried dialing, the line wouldn't connect. The signal bar on their phone was completely gone. They stared at the screen in disbelief, the silence in the apartment now deafening. Then, the knocking began again. It wasn't just the door this time. It seemed to come from every direction. The walls, the windows, even the ceiling. The sound surrounded Alex, relentless and maddening. They backed into the center of the room, clutching the knife, their chest heaving. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. The apartment plunged into darkness. Alex's phone buzzed again, its dim glow the only light in the room. The message read, "Turn around." Tears blurred Alex's vision as they fought the urge to obey. They squeezed their eyes shut, gripping the knife tighter. But the sound of breathing, slow and ragged, filled the space behind them. Against every instinct, they turned. A figure loomed in the darkness, its outline barely visible in the faint light from the phone. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow. It took a slow step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Alex screamed, swinging the knife wildly, but the blade passed through empty air. The figure didn't flinch, its glowing eyes locked on them as it took another step closer. The phone buzzed in Alex's hand again, the vibration startling them. They glanced at the screen. "You can't escape." Suddenly, the apartment seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the air growing thick and oppressive. Alex stumbled, their vision blurring as the figure reached out with impossibly long fingers. They felt a cold, clammy grip on their wrist, and then everything went black. When Alex woke up, it was morning. The apartment was back to normal. Lights on, phone signal restored. The knife lay on the floor where they had dropped it, and the door was still locked from the inside. It was as if nothing had happened, except for one thing. On their desk, scrawled in deep gouges across the wood, were the words, "I'll be back." Alex moved out that same day, leaving the apartment and the city behind. But no matter where they went, they couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was always watching. And every so often in the dead of night, they'd wake to the sound of faint knocking. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. as Emma settled into bed. The old farmhouse she'd recently rented felt alive tonight. Floorboards creaked without reason, and the wind rattled the windows as if desperate to get in. It was her second week living alone, a fresh start after a painful breakup. She told herself it was the house's age and the storm outside playing tricks on her nerves. Emma rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter. Sleep didn't come easily in this house, but exhaustion eventually overtook her. She drifted into a restless slumber, only to wake abruptly to a sound that froze her blood. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway just outside her bedroom door. Her mind raced. Had she locked the doors? She always locked them, but doubt gnawed at her. Her heart thundered in her chest as she reached for her phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up. No signal. Her throat tightened. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Then a soft knock. Emma's stomach churned. She climbed out of bed as quietly as she could, grabbing a heavy metal lamp as a makeshift weapon. The old door didn't have a peephole, so she crouched to the floor and peeked under it. She could see the faint shadow of someone standing on the other side. Her breath hitched. "I've called the police," she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. No response. Her mind scrambled for a plan. The window. It was her only way out. She slowly unlocked it, wincing as the rusty mechanism screeched. The shadow outside the door moved suddenly. The knob jiggled. Emma flung the window open, the icy night air biting her skin. She clambered out onto the slanted roof, rain soaking her instantly. As she crouched, trying to steady her breath, she glanced back at the window. A pale face stared back at her from inside her room. Emma gasped and nearly lost her footing. The figure didn't move, its lifeless eyes boring into her as if studying her every move. She scrambled down the roof and dropped onto the wet grass, her ankle twisting painfully on impact. Ignoring the pain, she limped toward her car parked in the gravel driveway. Her shaking hands fumbled with the keys. She could barely get the door unlocked, but she finally managed to climb inside and lock it behind her. The farmhouse loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and silent. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined the face. Then, in the rearview mirror, something moved. Emma turned slowly, her blood turning to ice. In the back seat, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, sat the figure. It was impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over its bony frame, its face impossibly smooth except for two deep-set, unblinking eyes. It grinned. Emma screamed, throwing the door open and stumbling out. She ran as fast as her injured ankle would allow, the rain pelting her as she fled into the woods surrounding the house. She didn't stop until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the muddy ground. She spent the rest of the night huddled beneath a tree, shivering and terrified. When dawn finally broke, Emma made her way to the nearest neighbor, a kind older man who called the police for her. When officers arrived at the farmhouse, they found no sign of forced entry. Her bedroom window was still open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. The car sat untouched in the driveway. But inside the house, scratched into the wood of the bedroom door, were the words, "I'll see you again." Emma never returned to the farmhouse. She moved back to the city, surrounded herself with people, and did everything she could to forget that night. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she hears the faint sound of footsteps outside her apartment door, and she knows the promise etched into the wood was not an empty one. The storm was relentless, rain lashing against the windows as Mia curled up on the couch of her isolated cabin. She had come here to escape the chaos of city life, craving solitude and peace. Tonight, however, the solitude felt oppressive, the silence too heavy. The power had flickered out an hour ago, leaving her alone in the dim glow of the lantern she'd lit. The crackling of the wood stove was her only comfort as she sipped her tea and tried to focus on the book in her lap. The wind outside howled like a living thing, and every now and then the trees groaned as if they might topple under the weight of the storm. Then, a sound. It was faint but distinct, a tapping at the window. Mia froze, her heart skipping. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the idea of someone being outside in this storm seemed absurd. She told herself it was just a tree branch, forced by the wind to scrape against the glass. But when the tapping came again, more insistent this time, she couldn't ignore it. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The lantern's glow barely reached, but she could make out the shadowy outline of a figure standing just outside. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared, unblinking, hoping her eyes were playing tricks on her. The figure didn't move, but its presence was unmistakable. A long, lean silhouette pressed unnaturally close to the glass. Mia's stomach churned. Grabbing her phone, she realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal. She cursed herself for not charging the cabin's emergency radio. Her options were limited: wait it out and hope the person went away, or confront them. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No response. The figure shifted slightly, and Mia felt the air leave her lungs. The lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept toward the window. The rain streaking down the glass distorted the figure's features, but as she got closer, she could make out its face, or lack of one. Its head was featureless, a smooth, pale expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet Mia felt its gaze, heavy and suffocating. It tilted its head, as if studying her, and then raised a hand to the glass. The tapping started again. Mia staggered back, the poker trembling in her grip. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't budge. Instead, it pressed its hand flat against the window, and, to Mia's horror, the glass began to bow inward, as though it were made of soft plastic, rather than solid material. She watched in frozen terror as the figure's hand began to push through the warped glass. Snapping out of her paralysis, Mia turned and bolted toward the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She shoved the dresser against the door for good measure, her mind racing. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she listened for any sound. It didn't take long. From the other side of the door came a soft, almost playful knock. Mia pressed her back against the wall, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The knock came again, louder this time. "Kay," and then a voice. A low, raspy whisper. "Mia, I know you're in there." Her blood ran cold. She had never told anyone about the cabin. No one should know she was here. The whisper continued, the voice taking on an almost sing-song tone. "You can't hide from me." The dresser began to scrape against the floor as the door rattled. Whatever was on the other side was pushing, testing her barricade. Tears streamed down Mia's face as she clung to the poker, her knuckles white. Then the noises stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the knocking. She waited, heart pounding, her ears straining for any sign of movement. Minutes passed, then an hour, and the storm began to ease. The oppressive quiet was broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof. Summoning her courage, Mia crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. Nothing. She hesitated, then slowly pushed the dresser aside and unlocked the door. Her hands shook as she opened it a crack, peering out. The living room was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she stepped into the room, she noticed something on the window where the figure had stood. Scrawled into the condensation on the glass were the words, "I'll be back." Mia fled the cabin that night, leaving everything behind. She never returned, but the nightmares followed her wherever she went. In every dream, she heard the tapping again and that low, rasping whisper that promised she'd never truly be alone. The clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m. when Sarah woke up, her heart pounding. The room was deathly silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Her one-bedroom apartment, nestled in a quiet city block, had always felt safe, until tonight. At first, she couldn't pinpoint what had woken her. She lay still, her ears straining for any sound. A soft creak echoed from the living room, a sound so faint she could have dismissed it as the building settling. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate. Like footsteps. Her breath hitched. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers trembling. The screen lit up, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, just a blank bar and the mocking words, "No service." Sarah sat up, her mind racing. She lived alone. No one had a spare key. Had she forgotten to lock the door? She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed, her just-in-case insurance, and crept toward the bedroom door, her bare feet soundless on the cold floor. The living room was bathed in shadows, the pale glow of the streetlight outside, barely illuminating the space. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The couch, the coffee table, the small TV, all untouched. But then she saw it. The chair by the window was facing her. She always left it turned toward the window where she liked to sit with her morning coffee. Now, it was angled toward the room as if someone had been sitting there, watching. Her stomach twisted. Clutching the bat tighter, Sarah approached the chair. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She reached out and touched the chair, her heart racing, but it was cold, unmoved. She exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. Maybe she'd moved it earlier and forgotten. She turned back toward her bedroom. That's when she saw the wet footprints. They started near the door and trailed across the hardwood floor, leading into her kitchen. Her chest tightened, panic clawing at her. Whoever had left them wasn't wearing shoes. The prints were human, bare, and unnervingly large. "Who's there?" she shouted this time, her voice cracking. The kitchen was dark, a yawning black void at the edge of her vision. She couldn't hear anything, no breathing, no movement. But the footprints didn't lie. She inched toward the kitchen, bat raised, her palms slick with sweat. The closer she got, the more she noticed something strange. The smell. It was faint, but sickly sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with damp earth. She reached the kitchen doorway and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb had burned out, or maybe something, or someone had unscrewed it. Her throat tightened as she stared into the darkness. A sound broke the silence, a soft, raspy whisper coming from deep within the kitchen. She couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice. Tears welled in her eyes as she backed away. She didn't care about being quiet anymore. She turned and bolted for the front door, yanking it open with trembling hands. The hallway outside her apartment was empty, eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. She slammed the door shut behind her and ran to the stairwell, ignoring the elevator. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she descended floor after floor, her bat still clutched tightly in one hand. She burst out into the street, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. Her feet carried her several blocks before she stopped to catch her breath. She looked back, half expecting to see someone following her, but the street was empty, the apartment building looming ominously in the distance. Sarah called the police from a nearby gas station, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of an intruder. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. The chair was back where it belonged, facing the window, as if mocking her. But the most chilling detail? When she returned to her apartment later that morning, there was a single word written in condensation on her bathroom mirror: run. Sarah moved out the following day. She never stayed alone in an apartment again. But no matter where she went, the sound of faint, raspy whispers followed her, and she always found her chairs mysteriously out of place. It was an ordinary Friday night when Jake decided to stay in. The week had been long, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. His one-bedroom house sat on the edge of a wooded area, secluded but cozy. As he settled on the couch with a beer and his favorite show playing softly in the background, the world outside felt a million miles away. Around midnight, he was startled by the sound of a faint knock at the door. It was so soft that he almost missed it, but the rhythm was deliberate. 3 slow taps. Jake frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his house was so out of the way that it was rare to have visitors. He got up and approached the door, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug. Peeking through the peephole, he saw nothing. The porch light illuminated the empty yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He hesitated, then called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Shrugging it off as a prank or maybe even his imagination, Jake locked the door and returned to the couch. Minutes later, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jake's heart began to race. He grabbed a flashlight from the side table and approached the door again, cautiously peeking through the peephole. Still nothing. A cold chill ran down his spine. He opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The porch was empty, and the yard was silent. He scanned the tree line, but nothing moved. He closed the door quickly, locking it and double-checking the windows. As he turned away from the door, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Wet footprints. They started on the porch just outside the door and continued inside, leading across the hardwood floor toward the hallway. Jake froze, the flashlight trembling in his grip. He knew he hadn't left those footprints. He'd been alone all evening, and the door had been locked. The prints were large and barefoot, the water shimmering under the dim light of the living room lamp. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. The house was silent. Summoning his courage, Jake followed the trail. The footprints led down the hallway and stopped abruptly outside his bedroom door. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He raised the flashlight, gripping it tightly as he pushed the door open with his free hand. The beam of light swept across the room. Nothing. The bed was untouched, the windows closed. He searched every corner, even under the bed and inside the closet. Nothing. Relieved but still uneasy, Jake backed out of the room. As he turned to head back to the living room, the flashlight flickered and died. He smacked it a few times, but the beam didn't return. And then, in the darkness, he heard it. A raspy, shallow breathing coming from directly behind him. Jake spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway was empty, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. He stumbled back into the living room, fumbling for his phone. The screen lit up, but his relief was short-lived. A new notification appeared. "You're not alone." His hands shook as he tried to call the police, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal was gone. The breathing grew louder, almost deafening now, filling the room. Jake grabbed the poker from the fireplace and turned in frantic circles, trying to locate the source of the sound. Suddenly, the TV flickered, the image distorting into static. Among the chaos, a shape began to emerge on the screen, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The figure stepped closer, closer, until it seemed to press against the inside of the screen. Then, with an ear-splitting crack, the glass shattered outward, shards flying across the room. The figure was gone, but the breathing remained, now accompanied by soft, wet footsteps on the floor behind him. Jake didn't wait to see what was coming. He bolted out of the house, sprinting barefoot into the woods. The cold night air burned his lungs, and the branches clawed at his skin as he ran. He didn't stop until he reached the road, flagging down a passing car. When the police arrived at his house, they found no evidence of an intruder. The footprints were gone, the TV intact, the door still locked from the inside. But Jake refused to return, insisting that something had followed him home that night. Even now, wherever he goes, he hears it. Soft, deliberate knocks at his door, no matter where he lives. And always in the silence that follows comes the sound of raspy breathing and wet, echoing footsteps. It was a warm summer night when Lily decided to take advantage of the peace and quiet. Her parents were away for the weekend, leaving her home alone for the first time. At 19, she felt confident enough to handle herself and excited about the solitude. She made popcorn, put on a movie, and settled into the couch, basking in the freedom of the empty house. Around midnight, she heard it. The faint sound of a knock coming from somewhere in the house. She paused the movie, listening closely. It was so soft that she couldn't tell where it was coming from. She brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe a tree branch tapping against the window. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time louder, clearer. A distinct, deliberate knock. It seemed to come from the back door. Her heart skipped. She muted the TV, straining to hear more. Silence followed. Curiosity outweighed her fear. She grabbed her phone, flashlight in hand, and walked cautiously toward the kitchen, where the back door was located. The house was dark, except for the glow of her phone. The knocking came again as she entered the kitchen. 3 slow, deliberate raps. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. She crept toward the door, her bare feet cold against the tile. The porch light was off, making it impossible to see outside. As she got closer, she realized the doorknob was moving, jiggling slightly as if someone was testing it. Panic surged through her. She locked the door earlier, hadn't she? Gripping the flashlight tighter, she leaned forward and peeked through the curtain. No one was there. Her stomach churned. She stepped back and double-checked the lock, ensuring it was secure. Then, gathering her courage, she flicked on the porch light and looked out again. The yard was empty, the trees casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Lily exhaled shakily and decided to head back to the living room. But as she turned, she froze. Wet footprints trailed across the kitchen floor, leading from the back door into the hallway. Her chest tightened. She hadn't heard the door open. The locks were still in place, yet someone or something had come inside. She followed the trail, her breath shallow. The footprints were uneven, as if the person walking was dragging one foot. They led to the staircase and up toward her bedroom. Her instincts screamed to run, but a strange compulsion pulled her forward. She wanted to know who or what was in her house. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended. The hallway was dark, the air heavy. She reached her bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Pushing it open with trembling hands, she shone the flashlight inside. The room was empty. Her bed was untouched, the window still closed. For a moment, she felt relief, until she noticed her closet door. It was open just a crack, enough to see darkness within. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lily approached the closet. She reached for the handle, gripping it tightly. The silence was deafening, her pulse pounding in her ears. She yanked the door open and shone the flashlight inside. Nothing. Just clothes hanging neatly and a few scattered boxes. Her relief was short-lived. Behind her, the floor creaked. Lily spun around, but the hallway was empty. She bolted downstairs, grabbing her keys from the counter. She didn't bother with shoes or a jacket. She just ran. She threw open the front door and sprinted down the driveway, not stopping until she reached the neighbor's house. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the house thoroughly but found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of anyone else being there. It was as if the wet footprints had never existed. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, as she stayed with her neighbors, she checked her phone for comfort. That's when she saw the new photo in her gallery. It was taken in her kitchen from behind her as she stood at the back door. In the corner of the photo, reflected faintly in the glass, was a pale face watching her from the shadows. She never stayed alone again. Mason had always loved his small farmhouse at the edge of the woods. It was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for working on his novel. Tonight, though, something felt off. The air was too still, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. He dismissed it as a side effect of the storm clouds rolling in and settled into his desk chair with a fresh cup of coffee. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Mason was halfway through typing a paragraph when a soft knock came from the front door. He froze. It was nearly midnight, and no one ever visited this late. Setting his mug down, he approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty, the only movement coming from the faint sway of the porch swing in the wind. He opened the door a crack and looked outside, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off as his imagination, Mason locked the door and returned to his desk. He had barely typed a sentence when the knock came again, louder this time. Goosebumps rose on his arms. He grabbed the flashlight from his drawer and approached the door once more, peering through the peephole. Still nothing. But this time he noticed something strange, a set of muddy footprints leading from the woods to his porch, stopping abruptly at the door. The wind howled outside as Mason stepped back, his mind racing. He wasn't the paranoid type, but the isolation of the farmhouse suddenly felt oppressive. He decided to call the police, just to be safe. His stomach dropped when he realized his phone wasn't on the desk where he'd left it. He searched the room, his anxiety growing, until he spotted it lying on the kitchen counter. Mason didn't remember leaving it there. The knock came again, but it wasn't at the door this time. It was at the window. Mason froze, his heart pounding. The knock was slow, deliberate. He turned toward the living room, where the curtains were drawn tightly over the large window. The knocking continued, persistent but calm, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew he was there. Gathering his courage, Mason approached the window. He pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. His blood ran cold. Standing in the yard was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and its empty eyes stared directly at him. Mason stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Panic took over. He grabbed his keys, deciding to leave and call for help from the nearest gas station. But as he reached the front door, he saw the muddy footprints again. This time, they were inside, leading from the window to the staircase. Something was in the house. Mason's breathing became ragged as he turned and backed toward the kitchen, gripping a knife from the counter. The house was silent except for his pounding heart. Then he heard it, a faint creaking coming from upstairs. "Nope," he whispered to himself, bolting for the front door. The knob wouldn't turn. The lock was jammed. He fumbled with the keys, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the creaking grew louder, closer. Mason turned, his back pressed against the door. The knife trembled in his hand as he stared up the staircase. At the top stood the figure, its head still tilted, its pale eyes fixed on him. Slowly it began to descend, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it wasn't used to walking. "Stay back!" Mason shouted, waving the knife. The figure didn't respond. It kept coming, its bony hand reaching out, its long fingers curling toward him. Mason's instincts kicked in. He ran for the back door, but as he reached it, he saw the same muddy footprints leading out into the dark woods. The door creaked open on its own, the wind howling through the gap. Behind him, the raspy sound of breathing filled the room. Mason turned to see the figure standing just a few feet away, its hand now pointing to the open door. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no." The last thing Mason saw was the figure rushing toward him, impossibly fast, its hollow eyes swallowing the room in darkness. The next morning, the farmhouse stood silent, the front door wide open. Mason's car was still parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Only the muddy footprints remained, leading from the woods, through the house, and back into the trees. He was never seen again.